Welcome to NDTV's pre-budget show, Budget of Hope, where we delve into the expectations and aspirations of different sectors from the union budget. Now, in today's show, we focus on the corporate world ahead of the upcoming budget. Corporates are eagerly anticipating reforms that can boost economic growth, enhance ease of doing business, and provide tax relief. On the show today, we will specifically look at the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry's pre-budget memo to the Finance Minister. Let me introduce my guests first. I am joined by Nirmala, former president of FICCI, and Shubhrakant Panda, immediate former president of FICCI. Thank you both for joining the broadcast. And we'll begin by first looking at the top 10 recommendations which have come in from FICCI for the union budget this time around. So if I can have that graphics up on the screen, please, which talks about the top 10 recommendations. The first one, of course, is to simplify the tax regime. Then to address food inflation, strengthen agri-ecosystem, enable MSMEs to meet liquidity needs, boost exports, build on physical and digital infrastructure, promote sustainability, make electric vehicles affordable, and promote innovation and research, and also to accelerate tourism. So now that is from the memorandum which has been prepared by the FICCI. So let's get into the first question with our experts, and this is a question that I would like to address to both of you. Ms. Kidwai first, what is your key demand from the budget this time around from the Finance Minister, and do you see any hurdles to that demand now that there's a coalition compulsion on the Modi government?
So I wouldn't call it a demand as much as we have achieved so much that it would be important to stay on course to ensure that both the fiscal discipline that has been announced, and the government sounds very committed to it, which is terrific in terms of not just hitting what they have committed to, but I think there's even an expectation that we might do better than that in terms of commitment. So staying on course for the fiscal budget, fiscal deficit would be an important aspect. Infrastructure investment, which this government has done very well and attempts to upend it, as in, spend it earlier in the year rather than waiting and spacing it out to continue. I think one of the areas that at FICCI we have pointed out is the interim budget talked of a 16.9% increase in infrastructure spend at the 1 lakh crore number for this year. And we are hoping that we could see this at a 25% increase over the previous year, as against the 16.9 in the interim budget. So for infrastructure expenditure to continue. And in all our suggestions, what is really underwritten there is the focus on jobs and skilling. And if you look at some of the sectors that we have suggested a push in, whether agri or tourism, it is with a view to ensuring that as we grow, that no one gets left behind. And in that inclusion, the whole issue of jobs, job creation, incentives in the direction of industries that are job intensive become very important.
Right. Mr. Panda, your thoughts on this first question?
First of all, thank you for having us on the show. And, I just want to build on the point which Naina made. So first and foremost, I think as an Apex Industry Chamber, what we focused on was what is in the best interests of the nation. And therefore, we have consciously stayed away from a slew of concessions and exemptions and, focused on specific suggestions which can add value and unleash the capabilities of the private sector. So again, to endorse what Naina said, the first and foremost point is continue the push on CAPAC. That is something that the government has done extremely well, nearly 5-fold increase in the last 10 years or so. And that is something that stood us in very good time, very good stead during the pandemic and its immediate aftermath. And as you know that, spending on infrastructure is something that has a multiplier effect as well. So that apart, a commitment to fiscal discipline, which is what I think, again, the government has done very well. And the third, I think, major focus was continue measures on, which will enhance ease of doing business. And from a tax perspective, which is what really comes into the purview of the budget, what we have looked at, what we have recommended is suggestions which will simplify the taxation structure, which will reduce classification disputes and therefore lead to less litigation, and also measures that if litigation is commenced, what's the best way out of that, so that industry goes on to doing what it does best, which is to contribute to nation building.
Mr. Panda, staying on that point, since you mentioned about the tax, so if we can bring up the recommendations which have been made by FICCI as far as tax is concerned this time around, I have two questions actually, a twofold question. Firstly, there's a stress on the importance to rationalize TDS rate structure that has come through in your memorandum. But also another corollary question that I would want to ask you is that would you or would the industry recommend phasing out of the old tax regime completely? Do you think it's even possible this time around? Because we've seen incremental changes taking place in the past couple of budgets. But as an industry body, would you think that it's better, if we are looking at simplifying the tax structure, it's better to just go with one regime, but to make it more attractive so that a larger number of people opt for it? And also about the TDS rate structure, how key is it to rationalize that, Mr. Panda?
So first, to deal with the TDS point, at the moment there are multiple TDS rates, and that leads to a lot of classification disputes and therefore litigation. So as I said, our suggestions are focused on how can we simplify and reduce litigation. So in that regard, if I recall correctly, broadly what we have said is one set of TDS rates or salary, which is as per the income bracket that you're in, and then broadly bring it down to one or two more TDS rates. And this is not something which is going to detract from the government's revenues, which they collect through the advance through the TDS. So that is something as broadly to bring about greater simplification. Now, secondly, in as much as the other question you asked about, sorry, you need to remind me.
Phasing out the old tax regime and to make the new tax regime more attractive.
Sorry about that. So in as much as the tax regime is concerned, what is very clear is that the government has focused on sort of nudging people towards the new tax regime, and that is something that I would expect to see continue in this budget as well. But whether or not they will completely do away with the old tax regime, I can't really comment on that. But I think given that there are certain legacy issues or other things that people have claimed certain benefits, I don't know if that's what the path that they will go down. But certainly to continue that push towards the new tax regime, which in many ways I think makes life a lot simpler. I have experienced that from a corporate taxation point of view as well as individually, and I think it makes a lot of sense.
Right. Ms. Kidwai, if I can also take a tax question to you. There's a growing demand to simplify capital gains tax, but from the market's point of view, it may be beneficial to not make any changes. Now, what are FICCI's recommendations keeping that catch-22 situation in mind?
Yeah. So, ours has really been more to simplify capital gains tax so that it's easier understood. So it's really back to not having too many brackets and too much there. And I think the underlying expectation is that if it is to evolve, it should evolve to the most favorable regime. So it shouldn't get worse, it should get better. If real estate gets taxed as capital gains, if you've held it for 2 years and equity is 1 year, then you bring real estate to 1 year rather than take equity to 2 years, etc. If it is to tweak capital gains tax to make it worse, I would say it would be a disaster. We have, in my 40 years, not seen as attractive a capital market for IPOs as we are seeing now. And it is critical because for the first time, we are seeing a range of industries, small and big, being able to access the market successfully. That when the markets are accessed, those prices stay up, that retail investors can benefit from this participation. And there has to, of course, we ensure that there shouldn't be too much hubris around this, but in a disciplined way, and SEBI's got a very eagle eye out on this, as indeed is important, that we must continue to encourage this IPO market. Now, what we've done in the first phase, because we have created liquidity, and I raise this because capital gains tax is an important part of this liquidity. We've created liquidity where PE funds, promoters, whoever are being able to exit readily. The exit enables them to invest in fresh investments. So you nurture one industry, you move out, you then nurture another. And this flexibility, this liquidity is important. On the other hand, maybe not enough is going into fresh capital expenditure. And in order to do that, we need to ensure that this liquidity stays in the market, because this first phase of really cashing in must lead to more CAPEX and fundamental investment, which is also needed as we grow. And I think creating and ensuring an attractive equity regime, also an attractive debt regime. We did put a bit of a nail in the coffin with the capital gains tax treatment on debt in the last budget, with the view to equalizing it with the bank FDs. That has not paid off. Banks are still really struggling to get their fixed deposits up. But if we could just bring back an attractive retail investment into debt as well, so that there's less dependency on banks, more issuance of bonds into the market, favorable tax treatment to equity and debt, I would say that that would be the right way to go. So I would favor not tweaking with what is not working, becoming more favorable in treatment of what isn't working, but certainly keeping an eye on how critical it is to ensure that we continue with what is working well for us and not taking a step backward there.
Right. Touching upon the point on CAPEX outlay, Mr. Panda, FICCI recommends that the CAPEX outlay should be increased by 25% to 11.8 lakh crore. Now, would that be a challenge if we are to keep the fiscal deficit target unchanged?
Well, what you have witnessed, especially over the last 2 or 3 years, is that the outlay for public infrastructure has consistently gone up and by leaps and bounds, and yet the government has been able to stay onto the fiscal glide path. And that has been helped by a couple of things, which is, of course, the tax buoyancy, the revenue buoyancy, the fact that GST is now really paying rich dividends, where you once saw about 1.4 lakh crores monthly collections. Now you are touching 2 lakh crores, and the average seems to have gone up to about 1.8 or even a little bit higher. You have had the dividend declared by the central bank. So all of that has certainly given sufficient headroom to the government to do what it needs to do, whether in terms of continuing its CAPEX push or making allocations to certain other key sectors without having to compromise on the fiscal discipline. And I think going ahead, that is important to continue, because it is not one or the other. We have to keep both going. So I don't think increasing the CAPEX outlay further to 11.8 or lakh crores will mean having to compromise in any manner on fiscal discipline.
Right. Mr. Panda, an additional question related to that. Now, there's a chance, considering Maharashtra and Haryana elections are around the corner, especially Maharashtra, because it's an important industrial state. Now, that more infra projects may be marked for that state. So is there anything that you would want to say to the government if, anybody from there is watching the show, as to what is the message as far as the corporates or the industrial body is concerned, as far as infra projects and the share of all states to that?
So, again, I think the government has done very well in looking at the nation as a whole and allocating infra projects where they are needed. So whether they are port proximate industrial clusters, whether they are freight corridors, whether they are ports themselves being developed, roads, highways, etc. I think they've done a good job in terms of allocating projects where they're needed the most. And as I mentioned, that infra projects have a knock-on effect on the entire industrial ecosystem. So I don't really think that I have anything to add as to what they should or shouldn't do.
Okay. Ms. Kidwai, if we look at the manufacturing sector, what is the main ask from that sector to the government this time?
I think the continuance of encouragement to the MSMEs and SME sector remains a very big ask. These many industries within these sectors have suffered through the COVID years. Not all have come out of it with flying colors. And that support continuing is important. And many of the points pertain to what Subhakant has said, that if we can continue to focus on the ease of doing business, we can continue to focus, as I was saying, on the liquidity that comes to capital markets, liquidity through banks. All of this is in the direction of ensuring that these sectors have access to finance, and we are able to grow and produce goods that are competitive and at lower cost. And the lower cost comes for all industry from the benefit of logistics costs coming down. And we have heard commitments from our government to bring the logistics costs down from 16% to a much more global lookalike, an average of around 9%. That brings costs down. Access to finance and cheaper rates of finance brings costs down. And ease of doing business, proper infrastructure absolutely helps in terms of bringing costs down. So on one end, you provide all of this. I would just add that I am a big proponent, and FICCI has done a lot of push on this as well, of industry parks. If we can provide this plug-and-play infrastructure to our MSMEs, it helps them adhere to a lot of the regulatory asks, including the environmental requirements, provision of renewable energy, etc., and enables them to focus on manufacture and not have to worry as much about every aspect of setting up their business, which can be a deterrent. So the push on infrastructure should include not just what we've just discussed, but also the infrastructure of industrial parks, also digital infrastructure, and within this, therefore, whether it is water, sanitation, renewable energy, all of these inputs need encouragement in terms of private sector stepping in to help, but also for government to provide for the services as required.
Right. In fact, we'll talk more about renewable energy in a bit, but first, let's shift focus to food inflation. Now, that is, of course, something which affects the common man, but it also has a direct connect to economy because inflation and consumption patterns are, of course, related. Now, food inflation is at 9.3% in June, largely an impact of climate change because a lot of crops had been affected by, the kind of inclement weather that we've seen. What are urgent steps that the government can take to mitigate that impact, Ms. Kidwai?
Do you want me to comment?
Yes.
Yeah. Look, inflation is not a good thing because it impacts every private pocket. And what's unfortunate is we've seen food inflation go up, and we got signals of this from the Reserve Bank of India governor as well in terms of his conversation, and therefore no cuts in interest rate at this stage, because while inflation is down to very manageable levels, the trend right now in terms of the split up is not good. I think a lot of it has to do with just the logistics of monsoons and, just the timing of this. And I'm hoping that it is stuff that will settle. But it is something that needs very close watching. It hits every pocket. And we, in fact, need to see demand go up. We have seen across industries, rural demand is still not where it needs to be, although improving. And with demand going up, urban and rural, industry puts more money behind investment and we see growth. If the inflationary pocket eats into savings and investments, it will definitely impact demand. So I would hope that in the budget we give into our middle classes and certainly our low-income groups more money, bearing in mind that inflation is still not in check. And this could only come through some incentives, tax reductions, etc., which enable people to spend more so it can buoy the economy and push growth up.
Right. In fact, for Mr. Panda, I would want to touch upon the sustainability factor and the recommendations which have been put forth by the FICCI in their memo. If we can put up that graphics where we talk about how suggestions related to a national taxonomy for green finance and to create pathways for green transition and to review priority sector lending framework. But what do you think, Mr. Panda, the government can do to ensure more private or encourage more private sector investment into green projects?
So look, first and foremost, just to reiterate the obvious, that sustainability is a very key pillar that needs a lot of focused attention. And the government at the highest levels has made it clear that it's not just growth, but sustainable, inclusive and resilient growth. So on the sustainability side, clearly, the national taxonomy that we talked about, broadening the priority lending framework to include electric vehicles, etc., ensuring that there is more, the ecosystem relating to charging and all of that for EVs. All of that is important, and of course, energy transition, and in that context, especially for MSMEs, because I think the larger companies, they're very clear what they need to do, and if they don't, they know who they need to talk to get these ideas. But in addition to other handholding that the government is doing for MSMEs, I think lending a helping hand for energy transition is important. Now, to come to your question about how to encourage private sector to invest more in sustainability projects, I think that is already happening, because as I mentioned, it's obvious that sustainability is a very, very important peg going ahead. And you are seeing major announcements by groups which are focused on the green economy, or conglomerates who are looking to put money into key sectors. So I think that is happening, and that is something that will obviously gather pace as time goes by. But in terms of ensuring that we have an enabling ecosystem with measures like proper green taxonomy, etc., I think that is what can be done to see that these projects are properly prioritized and move ahead.
Right. I probably have time for only one more question, and I'll take that to Ms. Kidwai. Ms. Kidwai, there's, of course, recommendations related to innovation as well. Now, why is investing in innovation and research and development so critical, specifically keeping in mind probably the fact that India is also looking at becoming the strongest manufacturing hub and also an innovation hub in this part of the world, and keeping in mind our competition with China? How important is it for the government to actually pick up the pace as far as investing in innovation and R&D is concerned?
This is a great question, and one which FICCI has been pushing for quite a while. And we have seen an announcement from the government, as you know, of the 1 lakh crore R&D fund. So it will be good to see how this is operationalized. So to answer what is a great question from you is, why is it important? India today spends less than 1% on R&D, 1% of GDP. The global average is 1.8, and that includes the good and the bad. And a country like the US is at 3.5% of GDP. So if we want to look more like a US, which is a hub of innovation and the capital that goes into that innovation, then we still have a ways to go. It's critical because the industries we have chosen to excel in require it. We are an IT hub, and there, without innovation, we would die. The pharmaceutical sector has been crying for a long time to get incentives to ensure that the R&D spend is encouraged within the sector. And we are a very big pharmaceutical hub, as you know. And now, as we look at AI and the new age sectors, again, this would become key. China has clearly set out for itself a target of being an innovation hub. And that focus is clearly there in President Xi's speeches and the direction that China is going in. If we want to be the China +1, or indeed the alternate investment destination, I don't think we can ignore this. And the skilling that goes into it, the job focus, and the spend and incentives, which are not really there right now, the incentives that industry should get provided in order to do this becomes important. And the ecosystem should be one where industry, venture capital, the science hubs that government has, the ministries and their spends all come together in these specific areas. And by working together, we ensure that we can commercialize better what we are doing in terms of R&D.
Right. I'm afraid we are completely out of time, but Naina Lal Kidwai, Subrakant Panda, thank you so much for joining us on NDTV for this pre-budget special, where we are focusing today, of course, on top industry voices and their ask from the Finance Minister. Thank you for watching, and news and updates will continue right here on NDTV.